Okay. Well, I'm gonna wait a couple of minutes here and to kind of let people join in if they want to join in. But what I'm doing this evening is that we're going to talk about the founding of Crossett. Just kind of like a low-level founding. This is not gonna. This is not something that I have specifically prepared necessarily. But what it is just gonna allow me to talk about it. Whenever I talk about it, I'll learn it, and you can learn it if you want to listen. Join in too. There's some. I think I can see comments on that thing every once in a while, but I'll check it some, and I'll try to remind people of this as we move through here. But I'm gonna just wait a couple minutes here. I really can't see. I got some glasses somewhere. But we'll wait a couple minutes and see if anybody joins in with us. Maybe bad timing for people. People may be eating dinner, going to church, what have you. But it's a pretty good time for me. Everything's kind of winding down. Me and Duke's been out here cleaning up. The weekend's kind of busy, unwinding, getting things ready for the week. And we figured we'd go on here and do about 20 or 30 minutes on the founding of Crossett. I'm going to wait just a couple more minutes to get going. I know one thing, I had to go up there and get some coffee a little bit ago. And I thought, I'm going to have to drink more water or something. There's something going on in this thing. I can't really tell. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, don't cough in the microphone, bruh. Alright, so a couple more minutes here and we'll get going. We're going to be live on Ashley County now and do a presentation on the founding of Crossett. This is my youngest son. Found him a 9.9 Johnson today, and he's trying to get her checked out. Okay, I think that we have waited a little bit. There's enough people here for us to get going. Thank you for joining. Again, this is just kind of a lower level, view of the very founding of Crossett, and I'm trying to put together a way for there to be some, some sensory experiences described. Because that's kind of the way I learn is by getting myself there, getting myself present in the moment, number one. So it's kind of like getting rid of the distractions, making sure that everybody knows, leave me alone. Daddy needs a couple minutes here, But when you think about this, I think about the founding of Crossett, and you got to think a long time ago, before anybody was alive. In fact, the founding of the Crossett Company was May of 1899. And that same month, there were people on the ground here in this area, in Crossett area. A lot of people, probably. By the end of that month, there was people here. There was, ongoing business concerns associated with this company in Wilmer and Fordyce. I can assure you that if you go back and you look at there's ways to go back and look at the Sanborn maps of all those areas, and you can see that the mills were designed a lot alike. You can see that there was a common eye amongst those mills, just like you can look and tell that there's a common thread amongst a lot of these company houses in town. What they call the hip roof. A lot of houses, or most houses probably are not that. They're the gable, triangular type roofs. But these houses all come down to the edge of the house, so they're called a hip roof at the top, the way it connects like your hips do. So there's that commonality in that, the commonality in the mills, commonality in the structure of the towns, In fact, that's one of the things that you'll see whenever you do any kind of a high level overview of Crossett. One of the things that you'll see is planned. Planned this, planned that, planned communities, planned, everything was planned. And, but now, one of the plans that they had, and of course it's one of the major stories that everybody talks about, or what Brother Buckner talked about. And then, of course, I've talked about it a couple of times in little writing that I've done that's more fiction oriented. And that's, about the Hamburg rejecting the Crossett Company, what would become the Crossett Company, the Gates Lumber Company, Crossett Lumber Company, whatever you want to call it. I think it may have been one time called the Gates Watzig. But anyway, there's always this thing of, Hamburg, quote unquote missed out, Well, I don't know that they missed out, It was just, it just wasn't to happen. That's the way I look at it now. Thank God it didn't, because that would have been very messy compared to what it is. But then again, this county, by not being connected, those two, the center of the county, kind of made it more bifurcated. It's kind of like it has two county seats. One of them doesn't have or hasn't had a courthouse, I don't know, kind of weird. But anyway, so let's go back to the founding of Crossett. Now, this is something that, that comes heavily from Cap Gates' tent city by John Wordy Buckner. I call him Brother Buckner. I actually went to his church for a while when I was a young person in the early 80s. And Martinville, north of Hamburg, maybe in Hamburg, I don't know exactly where it's at, but he was a preacher there for years, and he was a very scholarly person. Whenever you heard him speak, he was just, he knew his work. He did not get up there and talk about something he didn't know what he was talking about. That's for sure. So he was just, voluminously interested in this stuff and studied it and had all kinds of backing to study even more. And he was at the right time, before it got too old to touch, And the story I'm talking about, he's talking about, that we're going to talk about in just a moment, is kind of what the lore says about the founding of work, the mill placement and all that, after the whole ordeal with Hamburg. But, okay, so the story goes inside of the Cap Gates tent city is that, there was a friend by the name of Judge Lacala, and he, I'm guessing a county judge. I don't really know how that's set up just yet. I just say judge and assume that it's a county judge, but it could be his first name for all I know. But maybe he was a lawyer. I don't know. But he had helped Cap Gates with some land deals in the past. And in the story that's presented in Cap Gates tent city, Cap shows up with his horse and says, let's go for a ride. And, after they have coffee, they ease out there and they're riding around for a while, and then they stop to take a rest, just kind of looking at the property, and they come across the site, and they're sitting there talking, and Judge Lacla says, so what's wrong, Cap? And he's like, well, I was wanting to put that mill over there in Hamburg, and they said no. The town father said no, the city council said no, can't put it there. So, things just got really complicated for me. And then, the thing went on, and it's like, why don't you just build it here, Cap, is what Judge Lacla said. And next thing you know, he's running around. He said, yes. Like in my mind, it's reminiscent of those 80s movies, where they goes, I'll put the general store here, and I'll put the mill here, and we can put the corporate offices here, and we'll put the swimming pool over here, and we'll just, all this stuff, So, that's kind of the conversation as it unfolded there. And that's kind of how it got started. Before that, Cap Gates, rodeo arena, Cap Gates rodeo arena, that property apparently was Judge Lacla's homestead property. And it became part of the Crossett Lumber Company or Cap Gates' personal property. I don't know how that works. I've seen it delineated two different ways. But here's the deal. Uh, the situation uh, is it sounds logical that it may have unfolded like that. Just two friends out there riding, just something monumental just happened. You're sitting there and you had this plan in your head. In fact, if you know these people and their companies, you know that there was probably a big plan. You know, I mean, it was probably formulated in that town, and they'd probably already figured out all kinds of things to do with it. But it just didn't work out, so they had to go to Plan B. But I suspect that they probably already had that in mind too, if I had to guess on it, because you know how those things are. Uh, because they were ambitious. You can tell by the amount of money and time that was spent on this thing down here. You know, so the story goes, backing up a little bit, is that uh, Calp had become aware of this property. I don't know how he became aware of the property down here. The initial 47,700 acres, or 50,000 acres is typically known as. I don't know how he came across it. I do know that it was owned by a Michigan title company, law firm title company up there. Again, you got to think about it. Like Michigan, the northern forest was now gone. They had already depleted it. The northern forest were gone, but there was a lot of money sitting there. They had depleted the forest, and they were looking for other ways to do things. They purchased this property, apparently, somehow became a patent of theirs. I don't know how that came about, but they owned it. And it's a substantial amount of land, 47,700 acres. Think about that, what that is, you can think about it like this, is that, Felsenthal, you go look on a map, that is, 76,000 acres now. It was 67,000, 76,000 acres right now. By the time they started building the mill here, they had about 100,000 acres. So bigger than Felsenthal they owned in property. Most of it, just really great timber that would last for just clear cutting up until that last little quarter block there for about 30 years. But we're nowhere near that. So Cap Gates had learned about the property. He had got with some initial investors, and then they got more money together. They bought more property. Cap apparently had housing in Hamburg. Apparently brought his family there, and apparently that property was owned for a while. I don't know exactly what happened to it or where it's at. That's one of my goals, is to figure out where it was at. But apparently he spent a lot of time he had an office behind a barbershop, which is absolutely genius. That's where everybody's got to go, except for dudes like me. And also adjacent to the land office. So he was there, and anybody came in wanting to do anything with any land, he was trying to buy it. He was buying up lots of land. The story goes is that a lot of the locals were like, "Well, you better get down there if you want to get rid of anything for that." Or how's that exact phrase? I think it's like, "Before a fool and his damned money part ways," and that's what happened. Everybody started selling that land, to them. And I tell you, this is so weird, because I didn't really think about it until just recently, to understand exactly what the mentality was at the time. But, there's a lot of technology and learning that's going to come out of these woods down here from people from all over the place. But at the time, they really believed that, the second growth timber was no good for anything. They thought it was just slash land. It was good for nothing. I mean, they even legendarily brought in this a bull from Iowa, because they were going to put cattle on all this property. They really did not think that this would ever grow back to be anything substantial at first. At first they didn't. But I bet you though, you know, they learned real quick, they learned about those mammy trees, and we'll get to that at some other point. But they were out there, uh, just cutting through all kinds of stuff. Had all the slash land. A lot of it they were selling to people that wanted a homestead, and they were like, it's no good. So they'd already got what they wanted off of it, they thought. But it didn't take long, real quick there, 20, 30 years, that they figured out they needed to be going another way. They needed to be investing in property because they had figured out something new. But again, we're nowhere near that. But here's a foreshadow. When we do get there, you'll find out that some of the trees in our area, and Mr. Mike Chain was telling me about it, was that, some of these trees have been, people here would climb up those trees or get a gun and shoot up in those trees and get down whatever part they needed to graft. And then they would graft those trees onto other ones, and it would grow. And then they would, pollinate those good trees with other good trees. And, they would grow, they would replicate these things over and over and over again. And now across, particularly the southern United States of America, there's millions of these trees that are straight perfect. They grow fast. They're, disease resistant. All those type things, that they want in a good tree. Well, we'll get to that at some other point in time with the forestry parts of it. But this initial founding, their Cap Gates found the property, got it from the Michigan company with some investors. They added on more investors, changed things around. Again, I kind of hinted to it. It was like the Gates Watson company for a while. It was Gates Watson Crossett, then it was the Crossett company, and it just changed over time, contingent upon investment and agreements and whatever they had that going on, which I'm not privy to at this point in time. Charles, the papers are at LSU. I just hadn't went down there to check them out yet, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. It would be a great case study for a company too. But anyway, we're still at the founding of it. We're down here, bought this 47,000 acres from Michigan. We're sitting over there at the land office every day, 16 hours a day in the barbershop there. It's $18.99. It's 1900. It's around 1901. Almost 1901. There's at some point in time, there's dragged over there a little small saw called a buck sawmill, and they start using this thing to help build the machinery or the buildings for their tents and their corporate offices and for their mill around that thing. But this was a little small mill they had at first there, and it was just trying its best to keep up with what they had to do. And they were trying to get the big #1 mill over there at the same time. And they tried it on and off there. It was just wet that whole year since 1901. And finally, around November or so, they were like, you know what? We cannot wait any longer. We have got to get this thing over there. So they developed the skids, and I think it was 4 or 8 horses, maybe 8 horses. They took as much a part of the machine as they could, and they skidded this thing across the top of mud and these wet holes between Hamburg and where the mill's at out there, somewhere behind the Chamber of Commerce now. So think about that. That's not just let's say a hop, jump, and a holler right there. I mean, that's a distance. And again, there were no roads like we know roads now. There were no railroads. You couldn't put a railroad through there because it was too muddy yet. Now, again, things would change very soon into the future. By the time Reynolds gets here, he talks about it being dry. And, basically we know that during that whole time, there was what they call the Dust Bowl. So it was just very dry, dusty. You can imagine all this sandy dirt there. It's been dry for a couple of years, logging out of there. I've been around some of those areas in the 80s. It's just like powder. You burn puff and it just goes up, makes a big plume, you know. Well, in 1901, that is not what it was like. They say it was a very wet year. But 1902, I think it was 1902, they were able, earlier in the year, they were able to ship out the first product. May have been 1901, maybe in the end of 1901, but maybe it was 1902. I had to check on that, but it was a long time. The point, though, is that how much money they had invested in this project. The acreage, $7 an acre, but you know, money was a totally different kind of a thing back then. And, you know, it was did not have all the inflation that we have on money now. And labor was a lot differently scaled as well. You can tell if you go back and look at these ledgers, and I've had access to this OVT Switzer Jr. collection and have scanned it, you know, to kind of see what labor was traded for, you know. It's an interesting thing. But anyway, let's see. By the time the transfer rate was 33-1. So basically, when you around 1900, 1901, now it changes over time. It goes lower and higher, but around then it was 33-1. It was 34, 33, 34, something like that to $1. So $1 million in 1901 would be $33 million today. And those are 2024 dollars, or maybe even $22, $23, something like that. So it's probably different now, you know. Maybe, I don't know. But the $33 back then, relative to now, yeah, that's probably still about right. Plus or minus a little bit, you know. So there was a lot of money invested here, but you got to think about what all that meant. I mean, they had a lot of people out there cutting every single day, and you can look and see what they were cutting per day, but it was enough to build like, I don't know, 5 or 6 houses per day or something like that. It was, for the time and place, it was just crazy. They were dragging. They eventually were setting up these tap lines, tap into the forest, and of course that requires wood, you know, and you know the ties and building the railroad track, you know, making sure it goes to Hamburg. That's more wood. And you got to build all your buildings. You know, they had a big flea or lice or some kind of infestation in their tent city. You know, and those things were kind of houses. You know, they were made out of wood at the bottom and had like the canvas tops on them, but they had an infection and they had to, you know, burn all those things. You know, so all that wood was wasted. And incidentally, just jump forward a little bit more to 1912. You know, the Rose Inn burned. And I kind of mentioned it on an earlier thing. I wasn't as, my thoughts wasn't as clear, but, you know, they built this thing around 1912, this Rose Inn. And to build this thing required the use of around, you know, 40 or 50 acres of virgin timber to build that thing. And then it burned. And then they had to go harvest. You know, I'm sure it was mixed in with their, you know, their daily production schedules and just grab parts of it, you know. But they had to go harvest more wood, pay the people, the resources, everything to replace it. And they did with that virgin wood. That was beautiful wood. You know, you're not going to ever get that kind of wood again because it had sit down there for hundreds of years. You know, but instead of selling that, they invested it in their infrastructure. And it burned and they redid it again. And that's a lot of land. So if they were, you know, harvesting, you know, 7 to 10 acres a day, or maybe probably less than that. I can't, you know, the numbers are not directly on top of me, but less than 10 acres a day for sure. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 acres a day, you know, back then with their crosscut saws and such, you know. So think about it. You know, it's not easy just to harvest those trees out of there. It took resources to do that. Okay? I mean, it's really big resources. Makes you wonder how they ever made any money with all the things that they were doing and all the things that you have to have, specifically when you're a company town, you know. But it's like a trade-off though. It's like you have complete control of the situation. It's your property. And you can trespass anybody anytime you want to. It's a hell of a situation to be in. And you come there, and if you do, and you do what I call show up and show out, you'll have a decent life. Now a lot of things you won't be able to do, but of course, a lot of people don't want to do what they don't want you to do anyway. Spend their time drunk and gambling, which, was a big fight. Today we would call those, they're not pro organizational behaviors. They don't promote, of course, they may promote fun for people, but, again, though, when you move forward there and you look at these houses and all the stuff that they built with their wood, against a lot of wood. 40, 50 acres times 2 for the Rose Inn. Probably about the same thing, 40 acres, 50 acres for the hospital. And, and there was always things they were building around there. Had the Opera House, I think it burned, and a lot of places burned. Probably because there was drought situations going on after they had flood situations they had to deal with. They had ticks, fleas, lice, animals, all kinds of situations out there going on to get all this stuff out of the woods. Let's jump back and let's look at that out there for a minute. I've spent a lot of time recently studying those guys out in the woods and watching the videos of it. And I'm gonna tell you, man, that's a long, for me, that would be I may could do one, but I just could not imagine out there doing that every single day, just all day long doing it, over and over and over and over. Let me see if there's any questions. I can't really see my glasses, but you're out there, what they call sun up to sundown. You leave the camp that morning, you get you some, some bacon or some sausage, some biscuits, and some, some sorghum syrup and some coffee. So you got some caffeine, you got some sugar, you got some protein and some carbs, So, doing that kind of work, when you think about it, I mean, that is not a 2,000 calorie a day kind of thing. Those guys, they're burning off 2,000 calories before 10 a.m. And probably, everybody's keeping up with their steps. These folks, they weren't having to do that. I mean, they were probably just pure muscle, if I had to imagine. Most of them, they were out there on those crosscut saws anyway. That is, and they got to feed this thing, But now eventually it got to the point, where that wasn't enough. The trains could not keep up with it, so they were subbing out. They were getting other people to bring in logs, I think they were probably always doing that. But, here's something else to think about these early founding days. And we're not done talking about it, but just it's kind of an ancillary thing that kind of puts some perspective on it. I got to keep this coffee and water going in my system too. But, you got to look around here. You think about the Dust Bowl and Dusty, and you think about all the cutting that was going on here. And maybe they had multiple crews out there cutting. I don't know. They may have been able to work on different 40s at one time. I haven't really figured out if that's the case or not. But I do know this, is that at Stillions during those early days, you had basically the same kind of operations going on there. You had the same thing going on there across the river at Huddy. Hamburg had large operations. Monticello had operations. Wilmer had operations. And, basically everywhere you go, there's a Hamburg Lumber Company or Monticello. I'm sure there's Monticello. Maybe in somebody's name up there. I don't know. But you know what I'm saying? There's lumber being harvested everywhere because everything was being made wood back then. It was just the time and place for wood. And I love wood. This house is, wood and brick both, but wood is makes you feel comfortable. You know, it's very, just, it's a good way to live around wood. And it's sustainable. It regrows. That's something that these guys learned pretty quick, even before Cap died in 1935. But we're not anywhere near yet. We're still sitting around there in, 1900. Bought all the land, started bringing people in, labor in. This group, the Crossett group, Crossett Company, Gates, Watson, all these people, and they were not discriminatory at all. They were hiring everybody. And of course, that's kind of one of the things in Hamburg, like, well, we don't want you stealing our people, our labor, and or bringing in a bunch of misfits, because they wouldn't have control over it, which is another, makes sense that you had the company town. There were lots of company towns. Company towns were in mining towns, they were in logging towns, but very few of them were as successful as what came out of this Crossett group, specifically with this sustainable forestry that comes from what this group evolves into real quick. Just 20 years there. I mean, they're already in it. They're thinking about it in 1912. By 1927, in an article about Cap Gates, it's already huge. And then before long at all, you had, Russell Reynolds and all those guys down here. This was a planned money-making thing, apparently. I still don't know how it does. The infrastructure they had to build, I don't understand it. I don't understand the scope of it. Now I'm still wrapping my mind around it, to understand the level that they were working with there. And then, you got to think they had this thing up, going there by the 1st of 1902. They moved it over there in November of 1901. They had that thing up and rolling by 1902. The big sawmill early there, late 1901, 1902, you can see they started really going through some wood by then. 1902, they got that big #1 sawmill in there. By 1905, they had that second sawmill, #2 sawmill. You can imagine. Just think about what they're going through per day out there. And these things are top of the line, latest technology. They had the bandsaws in there. They had the, to trim the sides and all this kind of stuff. I mean, these things were just, it was just everywhere, doing everything. That's the way, I don't know if those are official academic terminology or not, that everywhere doing everything. That's what they were doing. They were going through some trees out there. Trees, and more trees, always stuff popping up. You had the community popping up. You had people starting to evolve. You had professions. You had brought in these different professions, and you had people learning things. You had people moving off of farms, and you had people, learning things, and you had people that were educated from all different kinds of places coming into Crossett, because this company was very progressive. And I don't mean politically. I don't know how they were politically. Don't care, but progressive in terms of they were always making things happen, always changing, growth. A lot of companies, they talk about, if you're not growing, you're dying. Well, that's exactly what this company believed, And Cap Gates, from what I see, he was, they had rules, and, it was like people, they tell you how to be successful there, and if you knew the rules, you could play the game, and you could be very successful here. And a lot of people left here very successful. There was lots of accidents there at first, your equipment probably was not the, it was, when you're getting something up and going, it's kind of ragtag. You have the best that there is, but it's just not all tied together yet, So those first few years was like a lot of people, there was train wrecks, the train they had, if some of their first trains used pine knots, and they would get too hot and take off or explode. I mean, just all kinds of crazy things happened. This was the days before OSHA. And incidentally, OSHA didn't come around until the year I was born, like 1970, 1971. You can tell, too, pictures, But now a lot of companies, like the Crossett Company, they learned real quick that it was in their best interest for insurance reasons, for public relations reasons, for all kinds of reasons to to uh, to take care of their people. You know, and they live in their houses. As you probably know, these company houses we've been talking about, the company come through every so often would repaint them. They had a crew. We had a picture posted recently, and there was like, I think 12 or 13, someone counted. I can't really see well enough to do it. I just have to feel my way through it. But, it was 12 or 13 people. They probably had them in crews, one or two crews of those people, and they would just go around like one spring, maybe they had a new client coming in. I worked out at the mill in the early 90s, and whenever they said, the big boys were coming in, Pete Carell or whatever it was at the time was coming in, clean the mill, stem to stern. Man, you would see everything puffed up, and then the next day or two you'd see, Pete Carell or whoever and some, Gary Beasley and some new client walking through, and and it all looks professional and everybody's clean and the mill looks good and new product is ordered. Those are the good days, right? And that's the way it was for Crossett for a long time. High quality products. Everything was pushed to be good. When that Crossett Lumber Company got stamped on there, man, it was good to go. Grading systems. We recently ran a little series on it. They have special people hired that were brought in that had these specific skills. There was mechanics. There were graders brought in. People that knew, stenographers, to help do the promotional materials, man. And these folks were marketing everywhere. They had sales offices in Chicago and other places. I mean, it was just everywhere. It was big, selling this wood down here. 500-year-old wood. Wood had been growing probably since DeSoto came through in the 1500s. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. One interesting story I ran across the other day, in those early days, they had drilled an early well there, and it was supposed to be for the mill. And of course, they needed, clean water, but it wound up being a salt water well, and this is one that they converted into a swimming pool area. They used that well to do a saltwater swimming pool. And if I'm not bad mistaken, it was in that opera house that we mentioned a little bit ago. So they had, it was a big swimming pool, with this salt water, which, a lot of us now have those these days, mine's a salt water system, So they had one a long time ago in the early 1900s, some of the people, when you look through there, one of the people that we always hear about is Rose, which is Capgate's wife. And of course, the Rose Inn is named after her. And, one of the big discoveries that we made by speaking with, some of her descendants, direct descendants, great, granddaughters or whatever, and it was brought up, and then, and I was able to verify it. It's so cool to know about such things. And that's in those early days, like in say 1923, 1924, Rose, she was to pass away there around that time from stomach cancer. But, she had developed it, and Cap went through, I mean, he pulled up a lot of money to have a very advanced radiology system installed on the back of the existing hospital there. And talking to Rose, which is the great granddaughter of Cap Rose, they had to, they had to add a wing, but adding a wing is not just tacking on some little square building on the back, not for Rose. I mean, it was developed as a 2-story thing, a lot of it being just maybe even false walls, but, it was developed to match and look nice, to go in a planned, coordinated kind of way. So all that stuff was neat. You look at those early pictures of downtown, it's clean. The buildings look nice. It's a presentation thing, just like we're talking about with these people from the clients, the clients and the presidents of the company stuff come in. Those guys, they want it ran a certain way because that's what they sold. they were selling this and they had planned it. I mean, this was not just, again, this is not some just sawmill they threw up out there in the woods and said, all right, boys, when y'all feel like it, won't y'all go out there and cut some wood? I mean, it's not like that at all. I mean, this was planned, executed in a beautiful way. And in fact, you think about it, that those families owned that thing from 1899 until 1962 when it was sold to Georgia Pacific. I think there were some stock trades there too, so it may even have owned it way after that. But so there's that's a long time to keep a company like that and keep that same level of progressive movement forward. Or it's kind of like let me say in terms that I know. I grew up in Fountain Hill on a farm. Of course, that what I understand is like with a pig, you use everything but the oink, and that's exact kind of thought mentality they had with trees. At some point in time, they realized they kept on figuring out this and that and the other. Like, well, you know what? It's just like a pig. We use every bit of this thing, and went through, developed businesses around that. They were first they were going around those early days. The hardwood was just, they were girdling it. They were killing it, going out there and cutting the circle around and spraying it or whatever they did to kill it, And, there were, somebody's like, man, well, you could use that instead of just letting it lay out there on the ground and be fuel for fire. We could use that to make charcoal, or, they had a hardwood mill over there. They could may even been that first mill they brought in. They could use to create and sell that stuff in at least small batches. And then, of course, by the time World War II comes around, there was a full-fledged chemical mill. They had the wood alcohol, the distillation systems out there that they used for jet fuel cleaner. They had, various other types of chemicals from out there that they were using from the wood and such that was, used in times of war, all the woods. It's even been said that more than likely, since the Crossett Company was so ingrained with the federal contracts and the war effort, and if you go back and you look at the honor roll for World War II for this county, you'll understand it. But it's even said and speculated that more than likely those nuclear bombs that were delivered, or atom bombs that were delivered to Japan, were delivered in cargo crates from pine trees, made from pine trees harvested here in Ashley County area. You can believe that. But this wood's everywhere. It went everywhere, done everything. You can imagine what all it's built throughout the years. Just like whenever the company was sold, again in 1962, there was 500,000 acres, and there's a lot of it had been sold, and they didn't just use their wood. So there's no telling how many thousands of acres of wood, virgin timber, went through these sawmills out here in those early days. So now I started this conversation off going, I just can't see with all these houses they built, how they made any money. Well, they were doing everything. They were involved in everything. So think about it. They owned the houses, but they were renting them back. They had the company store, but it cost money to carry things there, and they gave people the best prices they could, but they were still there. I mean, these people, these are entrepreneurial people. I mean, these are the same people that you'd see owning businesses these days. They watch every penny and every dime, because these things are investments. This is money, hopefully, that you can use to accumulate and power your family for generations. That's the goal, something like that. To set up like that, make a name. To live. Like George Strait says, there's a difference in living and living well. And with that being said, I've kind of rambled through enough about Crossett this evening, the earlier days there, from, Cap Gates finding the property, meeting with Judge Lachla, identifying the mill area, the commissary, start moving people in, rainy days, moving the small sawmill in, eventually sledding the other big mill over in late 1901, early 1902, getting things going. adding the second mill in 1905. Just voluminous amounts of wood moving out of those woods down there from tracks. Um, People with crosscut saws for years and years and years. You know, World War One wasn't that big of a deal for Crossett, but it did have some impact. During these early days, we made, boards that went into making floorboards for Model Ts. Was shipped all over around the country and the world, making these high quality virgin wood products. Wood shipped all around the world. Moving on up through time, brought in all kinds of progressive business professionals to help them grow and utilize everything that they could from these forests that they had invested such huge amounts of money in. And then went through the years of developing forestry, which they use trees in this area, the really grade A trees that spread millions of them all across the southern United States of America and probably beyond. And then went through all those years, the tough years, the World War II years, which were huge money makers, millions of dollars. Of course, tax rates were high too, but there was still a lot of money made. Till they sold out in 1962. Or, there's probably better words to describe that. But so that's an early days emphasis. And I appreciate you listening to me this evening or whenever you have a chance to listen to this. I got this hat on because that's where my microphone is at. I saw one of these YouTubers I watched. Had that on there, and I was like, well, you know what? That is a really good idea, I think. But happy Sunday. Be blessed. Have a great week. If you have any questions, send us a direct message or get in the comments or something, and we'll do our best to help you out. And I got to figure out how to turn this thing off, don't I? How about if I click this button